Hey everyone, in today's video I want to share how I would teach the 3 sounds of ED to first and second grade students. So this video is going to focus on the sounds of the suffix ED that gets applied to the end of verbs. There are some other rules that apply when you are adding ED to the end of the word, like doubling of a letter. That won't be touched upon in our introductory lesson. So this is usually the first lesson I teach to students when we are learning about that ED. So just to get that out of the way first, that is what we will focus on in today's video. When teaching this skill to my students, there are usually 6 steps I like to follow, so that's what we're going to walk through today. If you are ready to hear what these 6 steps are, give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and let's get started. Alright, so like I mentioned, this is a lesson I would definitely teach in first grade and is usually revisited again in second grade. So these are the steps I would follow for this lesson. Step number 1 is to practice phonemic awareness. Now that's almost always the first step I start when introducing any new concepts. I have this whole video right here where I walk through the basic steps I take when teaching any new phonics concept, so you can check that out. But we usually start with the sound. Now with other phonics skills, I like to show pictures, and then the students have to identify the picture, say the word aloud, and kind of identify what's the same about all those pictures, whether they all have the sh sound or maybe they have a long vowel sound that we're going to be working on. Here, since we're working on the suffix ed, this is going to be one where they're really just going to close their eyes and you are going to say the words aloud, and students are going to see what they notice about each word. Since there are 3 different sounds of ed that we want our students to learn, that's what we're going to focus on during this phonemic awareness practice. So I will start with the t sound that ED can make. And you can start with any of them. I'm just going to give you an example. I would ask students to either close their eyes, or if the words aren't written down anywhere, then they can just have their eyes open and listen. So I will tell my students, all right, I'm going to say about 5 different words, and I want you to listen to the words and see if there are any similarities or commonalities that you hear in the sounds of the words. And then I'll go ahead and read these 5 words aloud. Jumped, masked, asked, camped, fixed. After reading all 5 words, my students will discuss what they heard in the word that might sound the same. Here you're looking for that they all ended in the t sound. If you need to repeat the words, go ahead and do so and guide students to getting that answer. Then I tell my students, all right, listen to this set of words. Loved, saved, grilled, yelled, filmed. Now usually, since we just identified that the ends of those other words end in t, students will be already kind of prepped and primed to hear the end sound of these words and that they all end with the d sound. Once they've identified that, I tell them great, and that I want them to listen to one more set of words, and I will say words like this: started, ended, melted, planted, sanded. And of course the same thing applies here, and students will identify that all these words in this group ended in id, that sound id. So we had one set of words that all ended in t, one set of words that all ended in d, and one set of words that ended in id. Immediately after having identified the rule of each set of words, I then tell students, okay, great, now let's take a look at all of these words. Now I usually have a slide prepared with all 15 words that I just said aloud to students, and then I display the slide so they are ready to actually see the words with their eyes and notice what's the same about them. Of course, if you don't have a slide like that, that's fine. You can just write a few of the words, but I would keep them sorted by the last sound that they make. And have them written on the board. This way students can make that connection that, wait a second, even though all of those words had different sounds at the end, they all end in ed. So first we had students really listen to the sounds they hear in each set of words, and then we added a visual component there. We added the actual graphemes, and so students can see that all the words end in ed, which leads us to step 2, which is going to be our explicit teaching. So after you've had your students kind of have that aha moment, that phonics is so cool moment where they realize, wait a second, even though all the words end in ed, they have different sounds, this is when we want to teach them why. So during the explicit teaching portion, you are going to share 2 main things with your students. Number 1, you want to explain that ed is a suffix. So if you have not already explained what a suffix is, and this is the first suffix you're teaching, you will want to share that a suffix is attached to a base word. And in this case, ed is attached to a verb to make that verb past tense. So we'll go through some examples about what past tense means and the difference between I yell and I yelled, or I skate and I skated. And we talk about what the difference is, and we use those different tenses in a sentence. Side note, students will also definitely need to know what a verb is by the time you're teaching this as well. So if you haven't taught suffix or a verb, this is a good time to kind of teach all that. The second main thing you want to teach your students is why ed makes those different sounds. And this is where the fun part comes in, because there is actually a reason why that simple suffix ed makes 3 different sounds when you're reading it aloud. And the rule is as followed. When a base word ends with the sound t or d, the ed is going to make that id sound, like hunted. It's going to make that kind of id sound. When the base word ends with a voiced sound that is not d, because that was already mentioned above, then the ed is going to make the d sound, like spelled. Here the base word is spell. Is a voiced sound, and it's going to make d on the end, spelled. When the base word ends in an unvoiced sound, other than t, because again, if it ends in t or d, the ed is going to make id. But here, if the base word ends in an unvoiced sound other than t, the ed will actually make that t sound, like kissed, rushed. This is when you can go back to those words at the beginning and just pick any one of them and say, let's take a look at the word masked. Let's break it apart, right? Here's our ed suffix, and then we have mask as our base word. Let's check. When I hear masked, I hear the T sound, which means that last sound there should be an unvoiced sound. Mask. Ask. K is unvoiced, so yes, it has that T sound at the end. Masked. And then of course pick a few others from the other categories and kind of double check that it works. After I do this explicit teaching, I like to right away go in whole group with a sorting activity where you can pick a word, kind of identify the base word and the suffix, and determine what sound that ed makes on the end. So I have a free slide for you that I'm going to show you how that works right now. So here's how a sort would work in my classroom, and again, I made this slide completely free for you, so you can use this with your students. You just open it up on Google Slides, and it should work for them. And what I would do is I would actually start it off by picking a word, sanded. I would read it aloud. I would identify that the base word is sand, and I'm going to determine what sound do I hear at the end of sanded. I don't hear t. Do I hear d? Sanded. I really hear that id, that id, sanded. And why is that? That is because sand, the base word, ends in d. Then we go to the next one, jumped. Jumped. Here I hear that t sound. And we can go one by one through them all. After I've modeled a few, I will ask for student help. So either students can come up and they can go ahead and sort them, and the class can give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, whether they agree or not, so you can discuss them. Or you can just, pick a word, have the whole class say it aloud, and then talk about it together and see which column it belongs in. But right after we learn the different rules of this phonics concept, I like to go right into a sort like this so we can practice it. All right, step number 4 is to have students brainstorm some words with the different sounds of ed. Now, when brainstorming words, you can just do this whole group on the whiteboard. Since most of these words we learned are going to be the past tense of verbs, this is a great time to have students just brainstorm some verbs, add ed to it, and then we can kind of determine what sound it makes based on the last sound of the base word. Now, this is also a great time to go over some of the common ones that might come up with your students. For example, if we're starting our brainstorming by thinking of verbs, run is going to be one that many of your students will probably think of first. And this is a great opportunity to teach your students that run doesn't actually have ed on it. The past tense of run is not runned, it's ran. So when we're brainstorming our words, we always put ones that kind of don't apply over to the side, and we discuss why that might be. But for other words, students might say jump. Okay, let's add ed, jumped. What sound do we hear in the end? We know that's the t sound because the p is unvoiced. Now, to make this a little more memorable, there's an activity I learned in the Imsey Orton Gillingham training that I loved and wanted to pass along with you, and that is to have students make a paper airplane. Now, to do this, you will just give each of your students a piece of paper, and then you can throw a quick YouTube video or just a graphic with the steps to follow so they can create their own paper airplane, and then give them a minute to let them fly it across the classroom. Now, what does this have to do with the sounds of ED? Well, nothing if you just end it there. But this kind of tactile motion, this memorable activity, will then help your students in prompting a brainstorm activity. After they've flown their plane across the classroom, I have them gather it up and open up their paper plane. On their paper, I will have them go ahead and draw 2 lines to divide it into 3 sections, and we will write the following 3 sentences. We folded the paper into a plane. We soared the planes into the air. They crashed onto the floor. So in each column, they will have written one of those sentences on the top, and I have them underline that verb there with the ED in it. So we folded our paper into a plane. Folded would be underlined. Same with soared and then crashed. And what you can hear, hopefully with all those and what your students will recognize, that will create 3 columns for us to do our brainstorming. Then we can all go ahead and brainstorm together. Instead of doing it on the whiteboard, we can write down our ideas here. And then afterwards, I let them, of course, fold it one more time back into a plane and fly it again. Then they can take their paper plane home and they can explain to an adult why they got to fly paper planes in school. Maybe they'll even share the ED rules. All right, after brainstorming, we move to step 5, which is going to be some dictation. Now, when you're doing dictation with your students, you want to have students write the words not only in isolation, but also in sentences. And you can simply look up a ton of different word lists online for the different sounds of ED. If you seriously just type in a little Google search, I'm sure you will find a bunch of them. I have this little mini unit on the sounds of ED over on TPT and in my store. So you could also find some ideas in there. I have some word lists, but truly just Google it, you can find them. I like to give my students about 4 to 5 words to dictate. So here would be an example: bumped, smelled, grilled, handed, erupted. Now, when my students are dictating these words in isolation, I do like to have them kind of underline the last sound of the base word, because that's the rule we're talking about here, right? So if the word is bumped, here they will go ahead and write the word bumped, and then I will have them underline that P there, that P sound, and we can talk about how it is unvoiced. That's why the ED makes the T sound. Once they have determined the sound of the ED, you can even have them mark it as they dictate, just to point out again the emphasis that this lesson is on how all of these sounds end in ED, but they make different sounds. So I would do about 4 to 5 words in isolation, and then I would move on to some sentences. Here's some examples of sentences you could use. I asked before I jumped into the pool. I hugged and kissed my mom before she left. The plane landed on the runway. Just a reminder that when we are dictating sentences, I have my students count out how many words are in the sentence first, and then I repeat the sentence as many times as needed for students to go ahead and write it. We will underline the target words we're focused on, so here, if any of those words end in ED, we will underline it, and then we'll talk about what sound it makes, and then we always check for capitalization and punctuation at the end. And last but not least, step number 6 is to review. Now, we know we don't just teach this lesson one time, our students need to review these skills. And of course, throughout the week, you're going to give them more dictation sentences. You can practice another sort whole group with different words. That's all going to help them review. But if you're looking for some independent practice, I mentioned earlier that I have this kind of mini unit on the sounds of ED over on TPT. So here is a game that I have from that unit. This game is called Spin and Color. And here you can see that there's a spinner with 3 different parts, one to emphasize the sound T, one for D, and one for id. I like to have my students take out 3 different color crayons, and they color in each wedge of the wheel a different color. Students will simply use a spinner or a paper clip and pencil, and they will land on a sound. Then they have to go into the grid and find one of these past tense verbs that makes that sound or ends in that sound. When they find one that matches, they will color it the same color as the wedge on the spinner. Now, students can play this with a partner where they go back and forth and they read the sound aloud. You can have students take this a step further by, circling or underlining that end sound in the base word, just to, again, emphasize it and kind of point out this skill a little bit more. But I have a few of these different game sheets with some different words in that mini unit, along with some other review activities. So there you have 6 different steps I like to walk through when teaching the sounds of ED to my students. This is where I would love to know from you whether any of these activities are brand new, something you will try in your classroom, or if you have other activities for this skill that you love using with your students. Let me know down in the comments and we can all read them and add them to our own teaching toolbox. That free Google slide activity I mentioned earlier, as well as the Sounds of ED mini unit, will both be linked down below, so make sure you grab those. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up so I know. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel and click that bell. That way you're notified of all my new videos. See you in the next one. Bye.